Welcome. This is a unique event, but a very exciting one. I'm delighted that our honored speaker has been not only willing to come to talk to us about any topic that he's an expert in, but especially this one is of particular interest to me. My name is Mike Schneider. I'm provost and dean of the college. I also happen to be a historian, and I'm a historian of the history of internationalism as an idea. And internationalism has been, in some ways, an idea that has had a lot of legs over the last few centuries, but it's also faced its considerable challenges. By internationalism, I mean a whole set of ideas that don't necessarily even need to coexist, but they often exist in some combinations. So among other values or dispositions that we would associate with the idea of internationalism is that there is some quality or some components, some aspects of being human that are shared across all societies. And for that reason, there should be some portion of the international system that reflects those shared values and shared dispositions of human beings. We would call this the concept of universalism or cosmopolitanism. Even acknowledging that there are significant differences among societies and cultures in how they're organized, one could go further, or in a different vein, assume that societies, despite their differences, do things in similar sorts of ways, face similar sorts of problems, and thus create social structures that make societies a little bit more similar to each other, and that you can find kind of corresponding elements to the societies that they hold in common. This principle we'd call isomorphism. If you're a math person, it's the same idea, but just applied to a social setting. Even further might be the claim that because of either those shared values, dispositions of being human, cosmopolitanism, or the fact that our societies have certain similar structures and should cooperate in some way, that there is some kind of shared purpose that can be pursued. There are certain shared goals. You could pursue them politically, an idea that we'd call political internationalism, which might lead, among other things, to creation of international bodies like the International Postal Union, so we get our mail delivered, or the United Nations, which has many bigger ambitions. But these are political bodies that reflect those founding principles. Finally, and this requires almost none of the other claims of internationalists that they make. Maybe none of these other varieties of internationalism apply. But at the end of the day, we all have certain shared economic interests. And that the way we address those economic interests is to trade stuff. Technical term. I think economists have more elaborate language for this. But that we create mechanisms for international trade because the bartering and exchanging, which is seemingly as old as human beings themselves or human society itself, benefits societies that trade. We are now in a moment, I think as we're all aware, where there are strong strains of anti-internationalist thought, critiquing every single one of these principles that has held, in many cases, sway, maybe even dominance, throughout the last 100 years. These are ideas of unilateralism, economic protectionism, which we'll hear about today, national chauvinism, and authoritarian politics. Where we're headed, why we're headed the direction we are, why this moment has arrived is a question that we're all pondering, and I think today's lecture is likely to give us insight into that question. So, I only have 2 requests for you today. The first one is to silence your cell phone, and I can't promise I've done that myself. Mission accomplished. Please silence your cell phone or ringer or thing so that we can enjoy our honored speaker's time. And then listen carefully, answer questions. I'm sure it will be a very engaging presentation. Now, I have asked a group who knows Professor Maskus. I was just practicing names, and we were just joking about messing up names, and I almost misstated your name after all these years. But someone who knows Keith really well, and that is members of his department at Knox. So Keith did teach here for a term, and I am very delighted and honored to invite my colleague, Assistant Professor of Economics, Mohib Zidan, to the stage to introduce today's speaker. Mohib.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. As you said, my name is Mohib Zidan. I'm an assistant professor. Did you say?
He said louder, so speak it.
Okay. Yeah. Assistant professor of economics at Knox College. I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Keith Maskus. Today we will learn, hopefully, about tariffs and their impact on us, on our lives and our economy. I will say a few words about Professor Keith Maskus. It's a long list, so I have to read. There is no way to remember. Professor Maskus graduated from Knox College in 1976, having earned majors in both economics and mathematics, while also being a member of a well-remembered Knox soccer team. I received a comment why it was, you can ask around. Professor Maskus is Professor of Distinction in the College of Arts and Sciences and Professor Emeritus of Economics in the University of Colorado Boulder. He's an expert on international trade, including foreign direct investment, intellectual property rights, and the link between trade and technology transfer. Professor Maskus has served as the lead economist in the Development Research Group at the World Bank. Here is the list. Yeah. A research fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics, a fellow at the Kiel Institute for World Economics, and visiting professor at several international universities, including the University of Adelaide, the University of Bocconi, the University of Munich, and Peking University. Maskus also served as a consultant for the World Bank, the World Health Organization, and the World Intellectual Property Organization. He's the author of Intellectual Property Rights in Global Economy. He's also co-editor of International Public Goods and the Transfer of Technology under the Globalized Intellectual Property Regime. Professor Maskus served as the chief economist for the State Department as an accidental economist in the first Trump administration. Finally, I want to express my appreciation from my colleagues in the economics department at Knox to you for your willingness to join us as a visiting professor in winter 23, owing to string of retirements and the loss of our colleague, Professor Powers, Jonathan Powers. We welcomed your contribution to the curriculum and support for our young department. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Keith Maskus, who will speak to us on the topic, what are tariffs and how do they affect us?
Thank you. I like to walk around, so I asked for a microphone that fits in my pocket. Good. So let me start first by thanking you all for coming. I figure this is probably one of the first really beautiful Friday afternoons in Galesburg in the summer, so that was the competition I was fearing. I'm really pleased to see everyone here. And then just to start with a couple of comments, you know, there's an old joke in economics that goes very fast, goes like this. If you took all the economists in the world and laid them end to end, they would not reach a conclusion. That is largely true in my discipline, but it is not true when it comes to tariffs on trade. You will find almost universal agreement among international trade economists that whatever you think tariffs will accomplish, they're going to be more costly than the benefits you'll get from them. And I think it's especially true in the current environment, as I'll try to explain. So that's one thing. The second thing is tariffs. My goodness, most of the developed countries of the world have eliminated or had eliminated tariffs by and large on manufacturing goods and most commodities by the 2000s, I would say, the 1990s. And so even though when we teach international trade, we talk about what tariffs are and how they work, we just slip right past that because nobody really found that very interesting. It was convenient for me because I like to talk about investment and technology and intellectual property and things like that, which is where 21st century economics in the global economy is all about. But here we are. Tariffs have come back with a vengeance. So let's talk about it. The title is chosen by design. The president does, I think, see tariff policy as some kind of game that you could maybe assign a game theory tree or a decision tree to, but it's so volatile, so changeable that I'm not sure that there's really much of a strategy behind it. But nevertheless, that's why I say that. Okay. Briefly, I want to just say a few things about tariffs so we're clear on this. What is a tariff? It's a tax on imports, full stop. It only has its own word, tariff, because that went back centuries when, kings were setting their own trade policy. And you could imagine a tariff on exports. Very few countries do that, but we call that a tax on exports. But that's what it is. So think of a tariff as a tax on imports. And how does it work? Point this very specifically at a place back there. Over there? There we go. Okay. So on your behalf, in your honor, John, if Ford needs $1 million in steel, they don't, somebody else makes their stuff for them, but just as an example here, and there's a 25% tariff on steel, they can't take that steel away from the port until somebody pays the government $250,000. It's actually even more than that. You have to post a bond ahead of importing the steel so that it's ready to be released when it comes in. And so the next question is, where do I put that? What happens to these additional costs? Well, there are possibilities, and we certainly run through these in a trade course. Ford could pass it through into higher automobile prices. Now, they're facing, depending on where a product is made, 25% tariffs on imported cars, so that would be something they could do directly with cars. But even in the steel, that's going to affect the cost of producing a car. So they could do that. They could eat it by not raising the cost of imports. The president has told several department stores, don't do this, just cut your profit margins, which are not large in that industry. But I've seen the first time I've ever seen a Republican president, at least since Richard Nixon, tell private businesses how to price their product. But they can't do that forever, right? And if you sort of set a price that makes you lose money, eventually you have to abandon it. Or, this is what the president argues will happen, force or try to get the foreign steel producers to lower their price. And so when the president says foreigners pay tariffs, what he is referring to is the possibility that because the United States is such a big market and countries have to export their products here just to make some additional money, that in fact what they'll do is willingly reduce the price they charge for their exports. And so consequently, we get both tariff revenue here and we get not much increase in domestic price. That's a concept we study in international trade. If the United States really had that kind of market power, monopsony power for those econ students in the room, well, you could see actually having a policy that tried to benefit from that. But the fact of the matter is, even though the United States, largest market in the world, the evidence is overwhelmingly that that does not happen, that the United States doesn't have that kind of market power, except maybe in a short period of time. So there are many studies, dozens of studies of what happened in this context as a result of the steel and aluminum tariffs in the first Trump administration. Those tariffs still exist, by the way. but not for all countries, for some countries. But basically, they were passed through fully into higher American prices. And if you remember that trade war, we all would like to forget it, but here we are again. There were not just tariffs on steel and aluminum, but there were tariffs across the board with China, and nearly dollar for dollar, American prices, consumer prices went up as a result of those tariffs. So in short, consumers and downstream producers pay the full cost of tariffs, even in the United States. And this is going to appear on a later slide, but let me just try to cement this idea for you right now. The steel and aluminum, the steel and aluminum tariffs from the earlier episode were there, just as the president talks about again, to try to generate more employment in the steel sector, domestic steel sector, the domestic aluminum sector. And it did some. Probably the best estimates we have are maybe the steel sector went up by 1,500 jobs relative to what they would have done otherwise. Okay, I'll have more to say about that later, but in fact, when you raise the price of steel, who pays that? The car sector, the equipment sector, the construction sector, and on, metal products. The estimates we have are, pretty clear that generated, those tariffs generated a loss of 6,000 to 7,000 jobs in the downstream sector. And if you convert that into some estimate of how much it costs the American economy, for each of those 1,500 jobs generated in the steel sector, it was about $850,000 in welfare costs per job in the steel sector. That was a small episode compared to where we are now. So, having said all that, one other thing about this, another effect of tariffs. What does the protection mean? It means that the domestic industries who are behind these tariffs, because they have less competition from abroad, get to raise their own prices, all right? So lest you think, and there are certainly firms out there, American firms, who say, buy our product because we're not going to face tariffs, they will raise their prices because they'll be able to, okay? Now, here's a chart, a table that I would encourage you not to try to read through yourself, because I was trying to ball a bunch of stuff together into one presentation, this one table, but let me briefly try to take you through this. Argument one from the administration is that the rest of the world is unfair, they've been taking advantage of the United States, and so we have to do something about this. Well, column one shows you for each of those countries down the left side what the weighted average, or what we call effective tariff, was on manufacturing goods coming into their countries prior to this episode. So this is as of 2002. And you'll see, 2022. And as you'll see, United States is about 1.5% on average. That's low, right? But so is everybody else, going down to South Korea kind of high. The second column is the simple average. Those are sort of always higher because instead of weighting by the amount of trade, you just take a simple average. Okay. So the point of that is that the United States is not an outlier in being open to world trade. So the third column, the first thing that the second Trump administration did of sort of note in this trade tariffs context is these tariffs imposed on March 4th because China was not cooperating sufficiently on stopping fentanyl exports to the United States, and Mexico and Canada were not cooperating enough in stopping migration into the United States. I don't really know how Canada got caught up in that, since almost no migrants come in from Canada who are not documented, but there it is. So those tariffs were put in place, at least for a while. The tariff on China's fentanyl still exists. Column 4 is the Liberation Day tariffs. I hope you all felt liberated on April 2nd, because now you don't have to pay low prices for high quality imports. We're liberated from that burden. And that's what the reciprocal tariffs that were calculated, I'll show you the calculation, talk about it in a second here. They've all been delayed until July 9th, but they haven't been abandoned. If July 9th gets here and nothing has changed by that time, you'll see those very high tariffs go into place across the board on imports from those countries, and all 200 countries. There's some calculation like that. And then the last column is an estimate now of where we are currently. It's not entirely accurate because it's really hard to follow all of the details. But in essence, the first row there, the column and cell up to the right, is not tariffs by the United States against itself, although you can think about tariffs that way. It's that the weighted average now is about 18%. So it's about a 1% point higher than that because steel tariffs just went up, just got doubled, compared to the 1.5% a little while ago. You take a tax and raise it from 1.5% to 18%, you're going to make some big impacts on the economy. The rest are the tariffs now existing against China. So that rose to 148%. It's currently 33%. That's on top of some prior tariffs. And then just take a look at Mexico. There's because of the delayed tariff, they have, like everyone else, the minimal tariff of 10%. And then there's some additional tariffs on various things that aren't worth talking about. And then this 10% down the rest of the column, those are the minimum tariffs. They do exist. I want you to understand, prior to this, those tariffs were effectively zero. Now they're 10% across the board on every country that supplies imports in the United States, which means that that's where that 18% up on the top right comes from. We've gone from very open economy to one of the most closed economies in the world in just this few month period in terms of tariffs. Where'd those reciprocal tariffs come from? I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I just want to make a few points about this. So you may have heard of this fellow named Peter Navarro in the government. So Peter is, I actually know him a little bit. He's the president's trade advisor, was in the first term, is again. And he's, even though he has a PhD in economics, he's one of the exceptions out there, absolutely anti-trade, for reasons we can talk about a little bit later, maybe. But he's the one who came up with this formula. So let me just say a little bit about where this formula came from and what it is attempting, I guess, to do. So one of the driving arguments of the Trump administration and President Trump going way back is if we have a trade deficit in goods, so manufacturing goods, commodities, things you can eat and things you can pound and things you can drive, then it must be because the foreign country is treating us unfairly with high tariff barriers. That if they didn't have those high tariff barriers, we would have balanced trade. Now, a minute's reflection will convince you that that doesn't make any sense in the context of a world in which countries have different comparative advantages. They produce different goods more or less efficiently. And so some countries you're going to have a trade deficit with, other countries you're going to have a trade surplus with. And in passing, let me point out that they don't calculate using this calculation, or even in any of their rhetoric, trade in services. And the United States is a very large net exporter of services trade. So if you extend their argument about unfair foreign trade to the services sector, what they're implicitly saying is the United States is being unfair in the context of services trade because other countries have a services trade deficit with us. It's really nonsense. But the argument that Navarro came up with is we need to find tariff rates that will somehow equilibrate exports with imports. And if you really wanted to calculate something like that, it would take a long time with all kinds of very close data analysis to get through it, and they had a few days to come up with this. So here it is. XI is US exports to country I, MI is US imports from country I. Divide that by imports, and you get something like a ratio that tells you the percentage the trade deficit or surplus is relative to imports. Now that in itself doesn't mean anything, but it is a basis for saying somehow we need to bring the import number down until, for countries with a trade deficit, we have a trade deficit with, that goes to zero. Now, like I said, this calculation won't get you there. Where's the 0.5 coming from? Some of you may remember when the president was discussing these reciprocal tariffs, he said, don't worry, we're going to be nice to these countries. I don't know if you remember that or not. 0.5 is the niceness factor. So the ratio gave numbers that they could see calculating them were ridiculous, so they cut them in half to be nice. So that's where the calculations come from. And just to give you a couple of examples here, Mexico and Canada, looking at the 2024 trade data, Mexico, that ratio is about a 34% deficit, Canada about 54%. They wanted to treat both of those countries the same, so they took a weighted average. That's the number they got. And then, like I said, I made a few comments on this approach right there, but let me back up to just a couple of examples on this table to give you a sense of this. Singapore. Yeah, we actually have a trade surplus with Singapore in goods. And you might ask why that is. Singapore doesn't export goods because they don't produce goods. They're a service finance economy. But they do import a lot of goods because what that means is they take the imports from the US and Japan and every place else. They're a massive port facility. They do a little bit of value-added service to them, and then off they go to China as re-exports somewhere else. But in the trade data, that's all considered US exports to Singapore. So we like Singapore. We have this artificial trade surplus with them. That's why they get just 10%, because everybody's going to have a minimal tariff rate under this story. And then just one other, Lesotho is the country that got the second highest reciprocal tariff rate in the world. And you may wonder why Lesotho? Well, again, this is a really small landlocked country, very poor. All it produces commodities that we import from them. They don't buy Boeing airplanes. They don't buy high-tech machinery. They don't even buy many cars. So we necessarily have a bilateral trade deficit with them, which is large in percentage terms. So that's where that 50% comes from. So if those tariffs are actually ultimately imposed, they will be really large, but already we have this very high tariff rate as it is. Okay. There we are. So how did we get to this point? I'll try to get through this quickly, but 91 years of American trade policy in 1 minute. Okay. So you may have heard of this thing called the Smoot-Hawley tariff, which it was a very high set of tariffs imposed on certain commodities in 1930. Smoot and Hawley were a couple of American legislators, one congressman, one senator. And they were worried about what was clearly the onset of a downturn in the economy, which ultimately became the Great Depression. So within Congress, at this point in time, by the way, you've heard that the Constitution gives Congress the authority to set trade policy. Well, that was certainly true then. So they started negotiating within Congress on what they thought would be a modest increase in tariffs to protect some agricultural sectors, and then in Ohio, some industrial sectors. But then all of the log rolling and the lobbying began within Congress, and what they ended up with a very high increase in tariffs called the Smoot-Hawley tariff. That didn't cause the Great Depression, but it certainly was a contributing factor, especially when all of the other countries retaliated with similar levels of tariffs. And if you just go back and look at the history, within about a year and a half, global trade in goods had fallen by 2/3. And that's not unlikely if we see US tariffs currently go up at this scale and we get retaliation. So that was a disaster. And Congress realized at that time that, maybe we can't trust ourselves to do this. And that was the beginning of the cessation of trade authority from US Congress to the president, beginning with this thing called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which gave the president the authority to negotiate bilateral tariff cuts with the other major countries, which they did. By the end of World War II, and all of the post-war economic policies in place, like the International Monetary Fund, the Marshall Plan, and on, part of that was an agreement among the industrialized countries, the thing called the GATT, to start negotiating tariffs. And this law gave the president the authority to do that. Since that time, there have been 3 major pieces of trade legislation, not counting trade agreements like NAFTA, where Congress has made a big change in the legislation, but every time it gave to the president the authority to figure out whether a tariff has to be imposed or something else, and the authority to do that. And when you hear people say, but wait a minute, doesn't Congress have the authority to set trade policy? In some ways, yes, but in most ways, it has given that up, and the Supreme Court has agreed. If Congress wrote a law that said the president has the authority to set these tariffs, then we're not going to interfere. That's where that all comes from. So that's where we are. All of this was strengthened by free trade agreements and so on, and as you know, anybody who was here in Galesburg in the 1980s will remember that out on Main Street to the west towards Monmouth, there were 3 big manufacturing facilities out there. I actually had a summer job in one of them. Gates Products was great because I was a college junior one summer and was making $15 an hour in overtime at that time, in 1975, right? So you could see what would happen under those circumstances. If there was all of this liberalization going on, then there would be a transformation of production from high-cost areas to lower-cost, less costly, more efficient areas. And so, well, some of this went south in the United States, some of this went to Mexico. All right. This was all part and parcel of a fundamental transformation of the American economy. From the 1980s, when manufacturing employment was about 25% of the workforce here in the United States, to where it is now, about 11%. It's the same kind of transformation that happened earlier in agriculture, okay? And you can actually surprise people by asking them, when do you think the American manufacturing sector achieved its highest dollar value of ever in real terms? So I mean in price-adjusted terms. The answer to that question is in January of this year. Because the value of output continues to rise over time, even though employment falls over time. That's because of massive productivity gains. Happened in agriculture, it's now happened in manufacturing. We have a much smaller manufacturing employment base. So there is this problem. How do you actually protect those jobs if that's what you want to do in the face of globalization and massive technological improvement? All right, so I don't think we've had a very good answer to that, to be honest to you. And this process all just completely was put in overdrive in the 2000s when we had the development of massive supply chains and more technological improvements that actually made it easy to figure out how to take a technology developed in the United States and transfer it to Mexico or China or Vietnam and produce our intellectual property and technology with their wages. That kind of integration was a big part of this globalization and still is. So partly they're trying to react to that. Okay, I think I'm just going to move beyond this because you've heard about the China shock. Obviously, when China began entering the global market in the 1980s, but especially in the 1990s, and then when they joined the WTO in 2001, that dropped about 33% more labor into the global labor pool. Now, a lot of that was, at the time, unskilled, certainly low wage, but they've become a lot more skilled since that time. How did American presidents try to deal with this? Well, I'll just say that for most of this period of time, they just didn't do anything other than sign trade agreements and cut tariffs because that was good politics back then, even if it isn't now. When China showed up in this environment, a succession of presidents tried to rein in China in some way. The best example of that was when China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, In principle, they had to adopt the rules of the World Trade Organization, which meant cut your tariffs, but it meant also eliminate a lot of subsidies and industrial policies and so on that was, I think, fairly characterized as being unfair in the context of international trade. So all of this together generated this sort of massive pressure on US manufacturing employment and European manufacturing employment and so on. So that's sort of where we are. How about, I think we've already gone through all of this. Okay, I just want to make one other comment right here. I don't know this will work. Well, I'm going the wrong way, so just do this. When you think about what's been happening in this multi-decade period, it is the case that the entry of very large economies like China and more recently India, Brazil, Mexico, that has had the effect of putting real downward pressure on American wages. But by far, the larger impact has come from technological change. So, to go back to the steel and aluminum tariffs from the first Trump administration, once again, to illustrate what I'm talking about, why did only 1,500 or so jobs get established behind 25% tariff rules protection? Because if you're a steel producer and you have this protection and you're deciding you want to expand output, improve the efficiency of your factories, what are you going to do? You could hire more workers, or you could invest in automation, in robotics, better ways, more efficient ways that actually replace labor. And that's what goes on. That's what has been going on in manufacturing on a trend line for a long, long time. Well, you're going to get necessarily some political backlash to this. We saw this with Brexit in England. We see it now with the Trump administration. And no surprise, easiest targets are always international trade and immigrants if you want to try to build political support for interfering with globalization. So, all right, so why tariffs? And check the time here. Why tariffs? And can they revitalize US manufacturing? Well, that's a really good question. Trump's had this fixation on bilateral deficits for a long time. And you quite follow what I was saying about bilateral deficits before. People can usually understand the following story. It's certainly stylized, but it makes you think about it. You personally, you go to a dentist 3 times a year. Every time you go to the dentist, it costs you, I don't know, let's say $200. By the end of the year, the dentist hasn't bought anything from you, so you have a $200 trade deficit with your dentist, right? A tariff, if that's the suggested response to this trade deficit, would tell you as the patient, tax yourself because you have a trade imbalance, a trade deficit with the dentist. That's effectively what a tariff does. You say, we have a trade deficit with Mexico, we're going to tax American consumers to try to address that problem. So that's the way to think about this. Okay. So in principle, manufacturing could be restored to some degree. Employment could increase to some degree in certain sectors. It's a complicated question because if it was just steel and aluminum tariffs, as it was early in the first Trump administration, then we're pretty sure those would expand. But if you're going to have tariffs across the board, well, think about this for a minute. If steel tariffs go up, but car tariffs go up, rubber tariffs go up, then it's a really complicated calculation to figure out what the actual impact on the automobile sector is. But nevertheless, you can do that. We certainly have models that do that. And you're going to get some increase in some factories. I suspect that's true. But how likely is this? Well, it's not going to happen at all in labor-intensive goods. The United States is just too expensive to produce toys and electronics and clothing and footwear. And if you want a sense of why that is, Nike and Adidas and the others like that, Reebok, I'm probably showing my age here, but Nike does not produce any footwear in the United States or any rich country. It just doesn't do it. That doesn't happen. What they do have, after being chased out of China by their first set of tariffs, is a set of contractors, a lot of contractors in Indonesia and Vietnam In Indonesia, about 450,000 people work producing tennis shoes for Nike, and they're exported all over the world. So if you think that you can get that production replaced in the United States behind tariffs, what you have to believe is that the tariffs are going to be high enough that it makes it efficient or economic to use US labor for that. But not only that, you have to find 450,000 people who are willing to take that job. So that's just not going to happen. So not in those sectors. We talked about high tariffs on intermediate inputs like steel will probably eliminate more jobs than they create. Maybe Ford and all of your competitors can build supply chains inside the United States. I don't know what you're planning, John, but that's going to take a long time, and it's highly costly to do that. And then, as I said, this is more likely to generate more automation investment than new employment. Okay. And the last comment here, sadly, trade protection, if you are trying to build industry behind tariff walls, that, again, can work. It can generate some additional employment, additional output. Maybe around here you could see something established. But trade protection tends to be anti-innovation. If you are only competing domestically, the United States is a big market, so if there's enough domestic competition, maybe you still get pretty good innovation. But more competition drives more innovation, and the less competition there is, the more you're trying to produce behind these trade walls, the slower the innovation will be, and that means that we're going to likely see slower growth in the United States as a result of these tariffs. Okay, so let's suppose we do get this modest expansion of tariffs, employment through tariffs. That's good, but what's the offset? What is going to happen otherwise? Well, tariffs are taxes on imports. In rich countries, well, really anywhere, but we have lots of data and studies for the United States. If you put tariffs on imports, you're going to put the highest relative tariff cost burden on low-income households. And the reason for that is that low-income households spend a higher percentage of their income on imported goods like toys and clothing. If you go to Walmart, that's what you'll see, than do high-income consumers. And we have really good studies of this. Sorry. Let's go to this chart. This is done by a couple of friends of mine at the Peterson Institute in Washington. So what's this chart? Along the bottom, you have the income groups in the United States, from the lowest quintile, the lowest 20%, up to the highest 1%. And the yellow bars all going down are their best estimates of how much the tariffs that candidate Donald Trump was talking about before the election, how much those tariffs, if they were fully implemented, would cost in terms of changes in real income for those households. And what you'll see is for the lowest 20%, this is going to reduce their real income by about 4 or 5%. Up to the highest percentile, there's a negative effect, but around 1% reduction in their living standard. The upper bars, if you haven't read the chart yet, if you're interested in those are the impacts they calculate from the tax cut that happened in 2017 in the first Trump administration. That's the blue bars. And then the tax income, the impacts on family household income of the tax cut extensions that are going through Congress just now in the United States. And you'll see that those are biased towards the higher end of the distribution. It's not a surprise. Paying any attention to the news, you'll know that. But what does this tell you? It says the people down at the lowest quintile, they'll lose on the order of 3 to 3.5% of their living standards, their real income, from the combination of these things. But up at the top, they'll gain about 5% in real income as a result of the combination of these tariffs and tax cut extensions. Now, why did I bother going through this? It's because there's a message hidden here. The message is, if you want to cut taxes, income taxes, wealth taxes, estate taxes that favor the wealthy, then, and you want to find some offset in terms of revenue, one way to do it is import tariffs, but that will explicitly redistribute income from the wealthy to the poor, the other way around, from the poor to the wealthy. And that chart shows you quite clearly that's the case. And I suspect that that is a big part of the motivation of what's going on here. All right, so just a couple of other observations. We may see the emergence of 1970-style stagflation, which means low growth. Already the International Monetary Fund has lowered its growth impact, or its growth forecast next year for the United States from about 2.1% to 1.4%. I suspect that's probably overstating what the growth rate will be if these tariffs go forward. All of this depends on how high the tariffs go, how variable they are. So we'll just move on beyond that. It's hard to predict under those circumstances. What about other broad-based effects here? Well, tariff revenue, and this has been in the news the last couple of days. So the administration is fond of saying that the tariff revenues they will generate from these taxes on imports will be large. And the number they trot out is about $600 billion per year, which they can then use to offset the revenue losses from extending the 2017 tax cuts. So that's fiction. And the reason that's fiction is all they've done, and this is my former colleague Peter Navarro, who loves back-of-the-envelope calculations. In 2024, the United States imported about $3.1 trillion in commodities. If you take that, multiply that by about a 20% average tariff, we're not far from that, as I showed you, well, that by itself generates $600 billion in revenue. That's where that number comes from. But we're all good economists in here. What we know about taxes is if you tax something, people do less of it, okay? And if you put these stiff high taxes on imports, people will import less. It takes a while for them to adjust their spending patterns, but we have really good estimates of what these impacts are in the United States, but across the board and then sector by sector. In the United States, if we had like a 20% across the board import tariff, that would, over about an 18 to 24-month period, reduce the volume of imports by about 25%. If you had the reciprocal day tariffs, Independence Day, Liberation Day tariffs, if those go through, you could see tariff volumes, import volumes, and it says cut in half, I think is a fair guess. Now, if you're reducing the tax basis by putting high taxes on them, that's going to generate less revenue. And for those of you old style types, there's a Laffer curve going on here. Right? At small tariff rates, maybe you'll get more revenue, but at these tariff rates, you're going to get less. And the best estimates we have suggest that maybe working it all through, and again, this second to last bullet point, you can't just think about what's happening on imports. If you're cutting imports, you're going to get retaliation from the rest of the world. That's going to cut exports. You're going to generate lower income taxes, lower sales taxes. You work through all of that sort of general equilibrium stuff. And the best estimates we have is that maybe you can generate $250 billion in import tariffs at the level of the Trump promised tariffs in the campaign, much less if the reciprocal day tariffs, Liberation Day tariffs go forward. Now that might sound like a lot, but the federal budget deficit is over 1.8 trillion and is going to go up because of the tax bill going through Congress now, if it in fact happens, by another $300 to $400 billion per year. And so the tariffs simply aren't imposed on a base that's large enough to pay for those tax cuts. Just can't happen. All right. Okay, just a couple of other things, then I'll get into a couple of concluding comments here. So Trump also argues that tariffs can eliminate the trade deficit. Now, this is an intuitive claim, right? You probably think that is right. If you just raise tariffs enough, you'll reduce imports enough that the trade deficit will go away. The problem with that thinking is that, in fact, the trade deficit, I'll put a point up here in a minute, is itself something that is variable over time, and it responds to a lot of different factors. So just think about this. If you put big tax on imports, imports are going to go down, no question about that. But you're going to get retaliation from foreign governments. Exports are going to go down. And for reasons a little bit more technical having to do with the exchange rate, if you want to know, we can talk about them. Basically, as imports fall, exports will fall right with them. And the reason for that in economic terms is this. What does it mean for a country to have a trade deficit? And the better way to think about it is put services in there, so you're talking about overall trade. It's because our expenditures on consumption, on investment, on the government spending add up to a number that's a whole lot bigger than we produce in this country. Expenditures are greater than the value of output. There are lots of socioeconomic reasons why that happens. The United States has a consumption-oriented, consumption-biased economy. We have low savings rates here. We have very low taxes on consumption, but high taxes on output, so like income. So for all of those reasons, we sort of trend in that direction. The other reason we have this big macroeconomic imbalance is the government has a tendency to run large deficits in their expenditures. And that adds to the same picture. If the government is spending a whole lot more than it's taking in tax revenues, then that adds to the imbalance. So if total expenditures exceed total output, the only way that can be balanced, and this is arithmetic, that's all it is, the only way that can balance is if you import more than you export. Has to be the case. There's no other way to do it. It's the same thing with your personal situation. If you have an income of $100,000 a year and you spend $125,000 a year, somebody's going to have to finance that additional $25,000, right? Maybe because your checking account goes down by that amount, it may be because you have to borrow that amount. It's the same thing with countries. So another way of looking at this is any deficit of this kind has to be financed from borrowing abroad by selling U.S. assets. So current account deficits are equivalent to the net sale to foreigners of American-owned assets. They're the same thing. They're two sides of the same coin. It's arithmetic. There's no other way for this to work. Now here is where we can say something a little bit more meaningful about the Trump administration's underlying philosophy, which it's a little hard to discern, and the tariff policy isn't going to get them there. But it's this. Every time a country like the United States runs a large current account deficit, foreigners end up owning more U.S.-based assets. Do economists worry about that? Not really, unless those assets are being sold to finance nothing but U.S. consumption. If they're being sold to finance U.S. production investment, that's efficient. Okay, having said all that, another way to look at this is the United States is an attractive place for foreigners, and it has been for a long time, to foreigners to invest in real assets. So all of this flow of income coming in to buy U.S. assets is the obverse of the trade deficit. One implies the other. And the implication of that is if you really, get there, there it is. If you really, the only way tariffs can even begin to cut the size of the deficit. They can cut imports, but they'll also cut exports. The only way you can make that more in balance is if they reduce expenditures relative to output in the United States, or they tell the rest of the world we're not as attractive a place to invest anymore, and they start pulling out. Okay? How do you get to those things? Well, generate a major and sustained recession. So if that's the objective, I don't really think it is. If that's the objective, then tariffs can sort of put you in that direction, because as we've said, they are likely to slow down growth. But either of these things would be painful. Last couple of comments, and I'm going to stop because I know there may be questions. I've been very critical here, obviously. Any economist standing up here with my kind of training and background would be, but there are two other sort of big, broad picture issues that we haven't talked about here that you might discover if you went and read the background documents in the Trump campaign about international trade and some White House documents that have come out since then. Or what really are the big objectives here? One of them is here. Just fragmenting global trade is a good thing. It's not a bad outcome. It's a feature of the policy, especially with China. Why would that be? Trump people believe that if you effect this fragmentation and dramatically reduce the volume of trade, that will take care of the trade deficit problem. And not only that, it'll generate more domestic employment in goods-producing sectors. I would say a lot of us have been thinking about that. That's a claim that goes through about 12 different, very unlikely events in a sequence, all of which have to be true to get there. So it's pretty unlikely that you could actually generate this kind of positive outcome from simply using tariffs. If you wanted to do this in another way, here's what I think you would do. You would recognize, and this is the second thing I was going to say about this, and then I'll stop. What's really driving the American trade deficit, like I said, is we have a socioeconomic situation that biases in favor of expenditures, consumption, government spending. We don't have the politics that will raise taxes enough to deal with the federal deficit. We have arrived at a time in history when the personal savings rate for consumers, for households, is very low, and it's a little hard to know what to do about that. So we have this structural imbalance that goes that way. The Chinese, and also the Germans and the Japanese and a few others, have a different kind of structural imbalance. They are focused, their economies are much more production-oriented and less consumption-oriented. Just to give you a sense of this, the US personal savings rate, how much of US income goes into savings, is around 12%. In China, it's about 35%. That's a massive difference between those two countries. And what it means is the Chinese economy has a big surplus of production value over consumption value. And under those circumstances, they have to export the excess. So we have a big structural imbalance here. The Chinese have a big structural imbalance, so do some other countries. If you want to try to deal with that in a sensible way, what you would do is start dealing with the macroeconomic, socioeconomic, environmental factors here. So you could do things in the United States like cut the federal budget deficit. You could do things here like reorient the tax policy so it no longer favors consumption over income. Something like that, but in the other direction for the Chinese. And they're also trying now to try to reorient their economy to be more consumer-oriented. It's going to be difficult. That's where you'd want to go. But if you don't think you can get there, if you don't think you can manage a global agreement like that, then what can you do? You can raise tariffs and hope that you get there. That's what I think is really going on, is this idea that, well, we are no longer willing to be the place in which excess Chinese production finds its way at low prices. And so what we're going to do is force this structural rebalancing on them. We can't do it ourselves for political reasons by stopping trade with them in a big way. 100% tariffs on China would pretty much end trade. Those would be pretty prohibitive tariffs on the Chinese. 150% certainly would be. Where we end up, I don't know. Who knows? I don't think it'll be that high, but they're already 30-40% and likely to go up from there. Okay, I think I've talked too long. Should I just stop and see if maybe there's some questions?
Questions? Questions? Oh, great.
Thank you very much, Professor Maskus. Your presentation was really insightful to understand this really important topic. I have one question, might be not a good question, but how do they, in terms of like calculating the trade deficits, how do they count or like calculate the non-physical goods or services? For example, like let's say Google or Amazon or Microsoft. It feels like intuitive for me to sort of like they could be like a really, exporter in like a really large scale of like, exporting the U.S. services to foreign countries, and could be like a great source of like the foreign reserves. Do they take account of these to calculate these trade deficits, or?
Well, like I said, the phrase trade deficit, traditionally mostly goods were traded, refers to trade in goods. The current account, which is the right concept, adds some measure of trade in services. And the United States exports far more services than it imports. Now, services are kind of hard to measure, especially in the software industry, but if you think about it, what's Google doing? Well, there are people all over the world downloading their software, right? And they know where that happens, so they fill out surveys with the US government that tells them where these downloads have happened, at what volume, and assign some kind of value to that. There are ways to measure these things. And any measure will tell you the United States is by far the biggest net exporter of services, which, just last thing I'll say about it, makes the American export structure a little bit vulnerable here. The European community, European Union, their trade office called Directorate General for Trade, DG Trade, they have already worked out pretty much how the retaliation is going to happen against U.S. exports if these bilateral trade talks fall apart. And the retaliation is going to be on the software, U.S. software sector, and sort of the electronics, digital kinds of sectors.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name's Preston Johnson, and I've got a few questions. I don't mean to be hogging the microphone, but I very rarely get to speak to someone at your stature. First of all, on your chart, you said that inflation, or I'm sorry, not inflation, but tariffs are a tax, basically. Yeah. Is inflation a tax too?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so if inflation is a tax and the Federal Reserve wants a 2% inflation rate, so taxes are good or taxes are bad? What are you trying to say there? Because a 2% inflation rate compounded annually means that your purchasing power is reduced 50% every 35 years.
Right, so where the 2% comes from is a number of places. It's a lot lower than what we used to get at the 7 to 10% inflation rate, and nobody wants to go back to those days, that's for sure. The 2% inflation rate is designed to essentially mirror what is expected to be productivity growth. So, productivity growth, if it's the 1.5 to 2.5% range, which traditionally it has been in the United States for a long time, sometimes much higher, then that increase in inflation just offsets that. So you have more output at the same time that these prices are rising. So that's what the Federal Reserve sees as its tool for maximizing employment and minimizing sort of the net inflation costs. Having said that, you're right, a 2% inflation rate every year for a long time, if nothing else happens in terms of your ability to produce goods, will definitely make people worse off.
One other thing that on your options that producers had, like for your Ford, one of your first slides, you said that Ford had these options to do. couldn't they also, another option be innovate, create, overcome that problem? And I'll give you two examples that happened historically. One was when in the early part of the 20th century, the railroads colluded with each other to force John D. Rockefeller to pay exorbitant taxes or tariffs for the transportation of his oil. And so what did he do?
Well, he bought up all the other oil companies. And
No, he invented pipelines and was able to reap the rewards of that innovation to overcome that. The second thing that has happened recently was Elon Musk and SpaceX, when he was buying all his engines from Russia, and the Russians started screwing with him and playing games with pricing and delivery. And so what did he do?
Well, yes, innovation is a possible
He made the
response.
most powerful engine that's ever been created in the history of mankind and reaped the rewards of that to the tune he's the richest man in the world.
Yeah, but I'll just point out, he did that behind zero tariff barriers. The higher tariff barriers will concentrate power inside the U.S. domestic producers of those goods, and that's going to generate maybe more innovation, but I don't think so because the history suggests otherwise, and certainly some higher prices.
Thank you very much. Very, very engaging lecture. I have a question for you. So depending on the day of the week and depending on who's in front of the camera, this tariff regime is being sold to the American public as either a temporary negotiating tactic within the existing framework of international trade, or it's conversely being sold as this long-term reordering of the global economy that's designed to spur onshoring. My comment is those two things are mutually exclusive, and I'm curious to ask you, which of the two do you think is actually the goal here? Is this actually just a negotiating tactic, or is this a long-term reordering? And then I have a follow-up based on what you say.
Okay. So I don't really think that the president himself has a very strategic vision of any of this. I think he really enjoys playing these tariff games. But behind it, there are people coming from places like the Heritage Foundation who have this larger, longer-term view of how they need to get the United States economy moved from its sort of heavy import orientation towards a more balanced situation. And they think tariffs can be the tool for getting there. I think most economists would say that's not likely. Evidence suggests it won't work very well, and it's going to cost a lot in moving from here to wherever you think you're going to get. So whatever this great new equilibrium they have in mind is, I think economists would say it's just not likely because of the international reactions to the whole thing, the fact that the Europeans are probably going to generate some sort of trade agreement with lots of other places, including China, as a result of this policy by the United States. On the price impact, so tariffs tend to raise the level of prices, and then it hits a new level. It's not really inflationary in the usual sense, but people will observe substantially higher prices if these tariffs go forward. If you were expecting to pay $30,000 for a car, expect to pay $40,000 or $45,000 for a car. I don't think that that's really the outcome they want, but that's the outcome they're going to get. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so I guess my follow-up to that is this: if this is indeed seen as a long-term reordering, how does the Trump administration expect to do that from the unilateral basis with which they're launching this? Because what I know about businesses make investment decisions based on long-term stimuli, right? This has to be a sustained change of environment before businesses in Europe or wherever are going to start making these onshoring decisions. Are there any, is this push expected to outlive the Trump administration? You'd think you'd need to have a long-term bilateral approach to agree to this, to keep this in place. Thank you.
So there are two kinds of things that presumably are going on. One is using these threats of tariffs, which could go up and down by a lot from day to day, to try to induce foreign trading partners to negotiate with the United States on some. It's a little hard for people in my background to understand that, because we already had a trading system in which most countries had fairly low trade barriers. So it's kind of reinventing the wheel, but in an inefficient way. But if it turns out that these tariffs are sufficient and the power of the American market is enough, that countries will come one at a time and say, okay, we're not going to charge you any tariffs, you know, if you'll just sort of give us some advantage here, that could reorient the global trading system in an inefficient way, but not do a lot of long-term damage, and the business sector could adjust to that. But that's not how the rest of the world's going to react, right? If we say to the European Union, after a couple of days of negotiations, you know, we're tired of this, we're going to give you a 50% tariff across the board, and they think that's going to happen, not only are they going to retaliate, but they're going to start looking for other trading patterns, other trading partners, a new set of trading rules that essentially wall off the United States. That's what we're all really worried about in this business. And the business community should be, I think, really worried about that kind of an outcome. Okay, yeah. Go ahead.
Hello? Oh. Yeah, okay, thank you. I just wanted to ask that, so anytime that Trump, mentions the tariffs or whatnot, the stock market takes a hit. And, within the next 4 years, should investors expect that anytime that President Trump announces the tariffs, their stocks to go down, or should it be something that they just expect that it's going to blow over? And anytime that he announces the tariffs, stocks are going to just maintain the normal, I guess, price that they have, or should they just expect them to go down anytime he announces tariffs?
Well, I think it's more the shock value of these announcements that drives the markets on a daily basis than necessarily the levels. But having said that, if somehow a stable equilibrium in trade policy emerges from all of this, it may take a while. If that happens, then what you will see is that ultimately the stock market will adjust, I think, lower in real terms over a period of time to reflect that new set of circumstances. But I don't think it'll kill the stock market by any means. If instead what happens is just another 3.5 years of volatility and chaos, and nobody knows what the outcome is going to be, well, you can't invest under those circumstances. You don't know what the size of the factory you should be building now for 10 years from now if you don't have any idea what the tariffs are going to be. So the sooner they get to some stable outcome, the better for everybody. But my additional point I was trying to make about this, if that stable outcome is enough to force the rest of the world to say, you know what, we don't really want to trade as much as we used to with the United States, then that's not a good outcome.
Okay. Thank you.
So, I'm going to the last question to Rich Stout.
Well, I hope that I'm not the last questioner. I'm a retired econ professor here, and one of my favorite things that I used to like to say to my students in most of my classes was that our foreign students were my favorite export. And because we're providing a service, and services that U.S. provides to foreigners are an export. So just thinking locally, right? Knox County exports a lot of corn, a lot of soybeans, and we also provide this service to our international students. How can colleges and universities in general respond to, in a strategic way, to what is probably going to be a big drop in international students coming to the United States?
Should probably ask President McGadney to answer that question. Well, it is, in my mind, a remarkable mistake to exclude services from any calculation about how to run trade policy. So educational services, I think, are the third largest category of net exports, not just of services, but of anything, including commodities. And Boeing might be number 2, and then software, I think, is number 1. So, Boeing aircraft. So the idea that you would tell colleges and universities that they can't continue to provide this service when you're worried at the same level, when you're worried about sort of exports and how to build them, to me is just kind of strange, just bizarre. I don't have a good answer for what college, I mean, I would say that acting alone is not likely to be the answer. So there have to be collaborative approaches. I think Harvard isn't a class by itself, but even they're going to have to come to an accommodation at some point. This is, I'm sorry to say this is not about stopping foreign students from coming to the United States. This is about debilitating the higher education sector in the United States. I find it amazing that anybody thinks that's a way to run this country, but there it is. And why do they want to do that? We could speculate, but it has to do with, in my mind, diminishing the power of voices that might raise an opposition to what you're trying to do otherwise. So are foreign students collateral damage here to some degree? Yes. However, I would encourage all of you and everybody you know who might want to come to the United States to study. We're a long way from having any kind of equilibrium here, some kind of outcome. I think the courts will get involved in this in a very large way. So that's a meandering answer. But what colleges and universities can do is band together and support each other. So I don't know what the ACM might be doing, but it might be even really microeconomic things like saying, and this is, believe me, I'm no expert on these kinds of processes, so just take this with a boulder of salt, if you will. I'm worried that as the number of foreign students who can't get visas increases, and so fewer students show up to go to a Knox college or to an Augustana or a Beloit, that those colleges will say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to grab some domestic students to try to fill our quotas with better deals. And I would hope that the colleges can find a way to avoid that kind of competition. That's a microeconomic answer to a macroeconomic question, but I just think we have to do the best you can to stand up on a collaborative basis to say we can't operate this way.
Well, Keith, this was extraordinarily insightful, and I know there are a lot more questions in the audience that we could possibly get to, but it's just because you've stimulated so many things we'd want to think about and ask you about. There are going to be very delightful refreshments outside the door when we go out there, so I hope you'll hang out and relax and continue the conversation. But would you please join me in thanking our friend Keith Maskus.
Again, I'm still amazed that you spent your late Friday afternoon doing this, so thank you.